So this is Synopsis, a series of conversations in the framework of Abeceda Institute. Today with us is Aleksandra Woźniak. And Aleksandra, please tell me if I pronounced your name correctly. And as well, I would ask you to introduce yourself.
All right, well, Neža, that was correct.
All right.
That was correct pronunciation. My name is Aleksandra Woźniak, and I am a composer of Polish origin, as my name suggests. I am a sophomore at the Peabody Institute, and I'm studying with Oscar Bettison. I've studied in the past with Alyssa Weinberg, and I took a few lessons with other faculty at the Peabody Institute, Kevin Putz, Michael Hersch, and others. I have been composing ever since I was 16. And the art of composition was first appealed to me because I thought of it as a very interdisciplinary art where I could combine everything I've done up to that point. I was always interested in poetry, meter, writing, and the visual arts. And this new medium of composition provided me with some opportunities that I feel weren't available to me in the arts. And obviously, I also practiced music. I was a cellist for a good number of years, and that is how I first came to the composition world. At first, I began only with playing music, and then at 15, so a year before I started, I felt that there were shortages in some particular repertoire, and it is possible for me to combine all my interests into one and work with this new medium and possibly come up with something new.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a mentor for composition that helped you with that? Or how did you come to composition? How did composition come to?
So I was fortunate enough to join the local youth composition program provided by my youth symphony orchestra. And that is where I met my mentor at the time, who first introduced me to some aspects of composition and helped me refine others. It was in that program also that I met the first people with my interests as well who were going to conservatory. So it allowed me to start my network that way. And my mentor also prepared me a little bit for the conservatory requirements, and it gave me a solid base to start working on.
Did that mean that you also had the opportunity to immediately write for the youth orchestra?
Actually, yes, it was a quite wonderful program. We had two huge projects, one for each semester. The first one was a chamber piece. That year, the medium was wind quintet. And then second semester, which is pretty ambitious task for a 17-year-old, but we had to write for a full symphony orchestra, which again is a very ambitious task, but it really introduced me to the difficulties of large ensemble writing early on and made me realize that I have to work in steps to get there. And currently up to date, that is my dream medium, and that's what I started with. So I am a bit intimidated of it at the moment, but I'm working my way to get there, and hopefully in a number of years, it will be possible again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because to get a full orchestra to perform a piece of yours is actually not an easy task today.
Oh yeah.
So that means you already, like one of your first works was an orchestral work. Is, let's say, that work something that you will build on in the future, something when you will work for a symphonic orchestra again? Is that, let's say, to put it in a different, in a question in general for your compositional practice, do you practice building on top of other works in any kind of way?
Yes, I do that often, because like any composer and perfectionist, I'm never satisfied with the end result. So there are a lot of my pieces, I continue to build upon them. And ultimately, I will refine a lot in that piece in parallel. But there are some good ideas that I like to draw from that piece, and then hopefully in a number of years incorporate them um, into a symphonic work.
Mhm. That brings me to the question: what do you then currently work on? Is it also important what ensembles and maybe soloists you have at disposal to perform your pieces when you decide when you compose, or what when you decide what you will compose?
Yes, so currently in preparation for larger scale works, I decided alongside my teachers to focus more on chamber works and even some solo works, as solo writing is extremely difficult and gets you let allows you to get to know the instrument very intimately. Same with chamber works. So I feel like there's great value in spending all my time right now focusing on refining my chamber writing, as that later, those are later the elements that I can incorporate into a large ensemble piece.
Mhm. Plus, I guess you have chamber ensembles easier, more available to perform.
Well, it depends on the people, you know. Oftentimes, I find myself writing for what is needed, whoever needs a piece of work. So some of my pieces have very strange instrumentations, um, as it is the people are currently in need of a piece. One of my largest chamber works that I produced in the last year was a piece, it was a septet for three cellos, three voices, and a bassoon, which I have never come across that instrumentation in my life before.
Mm.
Um, but the opportunity, the moment it called for it, and um, it turns out it really blended quite beautifully. And I was surprised by how, when my options are limited, and when I have a set or orchestration instrumentation to work with, how creative I can be. And it was a really, really valuable project that taught me a lot.
Mhm. So, uh, yeah, then that brings to the um, limitation as something that can, yeah, as you said it, foster creativity, or maybe even open space elsewhere where the limit is not set. Uh, do you do you ever use that in your own practice, also in general? Just um, do you put restrictions on intentionally sometimes to, or what what other process would you say that you implement in your composition?
Yeah, so I feel that for me, um, limitations actually yield the most creativity, which I know is not the case for a lot of composers, as they're abandoning form and there's a total freedom in the music, which I've also experimented with. But I feel that for me, there is more creativity when I have any kind of restriction placed on me. Let it be form, a set, a particular instrumentation. Um, yeah.
I mean, when you say abandoning form, whenever I participated in something that was supposed to be without form, it always ended up with there being a form, just usually a fairly a simple one, or even nothing wrong with a simple form, but usually
Yeah.
it always resulted in there being form, but just the habitual one that happens. So I'm just wondering, do you think is it possible to abandon form and have it completely free if in general with people in your experience?
I'm not quite sure. However, with my personal compositions, even if I do aim to abandon form, there's always a form that shows through. Um, it's hard to conceptualize no form, the concept of no form, as there is always sound in most compositions, or even the lack of sound. There is substance to the composition. Um, and with that, there is an innate structure, whatever it may be. Just like it's been difficult to conceptualize the number zero and just absolute nothingness for years, as we're so used to um, being.
Mhm. And what about form in your composition? How do you build form or conceive of form in composition?
So when I begin a composition, I usually don't think about form. Um, the form does come, and based on the form that comes, I then decide whether to continue with it or to add on. The forms the forms can be strange sometimes, but I always try to find a pattern in my composition. And however subtle that pattern may be, I try for the pattern to show in a way.
Mhm. And what kind of patterns do show to you as a composer? I mean,
Well, sometimes it may be something as simple as rounded binary form, or sometimes it's more of a case
I
of,
didn't catch the first one. Sorry.
yeah. So sometimes it may just be the case of simple form, like ternary, binary, any traditional form.
Mhm.
But most of the time there's always form, but it's unconventional. For example, in my septet piece, I strictly followed the lines in a poem, and I grouped the poem into sections. And when you have the poem side by side and really dissect the piece, it is clear that the entire piece is really just in four sections. However fluid it may sound, and despite all the transitions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's the form of the form, basically.
Yes.
And further. And any others, like, how do you think that influences the music, let's say? Or maybe before we go there, how do you conceive of composition in general and, let's say, relationship between composition and music?
Well, I think composition is a very interdisciplinary practice. And for me, at least at this point in time, it does not exist on its own. My compositional process is fulfilled constantly with other art forms. I find myself, drawing inspiration from other art forms that I've been exposed to. Um, and I feel like it's just, it cannot exist on its own. I repeat, for me in this point in time. Um, and that is, I feel like I tie that meaning between the two art forms when I do that, um, and give it substance in that way.
And the music,
In the music, um, the music itself, it does sometimes exist on its own, but it's strange. I don't think necessarily, sometimes of a melody, I don't think of it as being the art of composition. Sometimes a melody just comes, and I draw a lot of my inspiration from folk music, as that was the music I was primarily surrounded by growing up. And I just, having been exposed to folk music in particular, I actually associate certain melodies more with other art forms than composition, which is interesting.
Right, because composition is, I mean, not, as I notice it, not that, when, let's say, when you're in touch with folk music, composition is simply not one of the first disciplines or notions that arises when you talk about it or when you think about
Yes.
it. And I do think it's not necessarily, that does not necessarily mean it's not really there. Just the process of it is very different, and as I said, not really called composition. And it's a very different discipline than the one that we refer to with composition in academia or in a music school. But also an interesting thought here to me is I'm starting to notice how this question always carries interesting questionings of what is a part of music and what isn't a part of music. And that's maybe also what I'm asking for you, let's say, as a composer. Where do you think, if anywhere, that there's a border between these?
Between composition and music?
Between music and everything else, and between composition and everything else.
So I haven't drawn the line yet, personally, and I don't think I will anytime soon, because the line is very vague. As the sound around us constitutes music for me, since it is pitches, and especially with contemporary music, and just the different tuning systems and quarter tones and microtonal counterpoint. It's just it's hard to draw the line, define music itself. It's really everything that surrounds us, and it could even possibly be something other than sound. I do think that even music itself shouldn't be grouped by itself. It's really, if the line between music and composition is so vague, I think it might be the same for music and its other artistic counterparts and other art forms.
And keep in mind, it's not even asking only about the other art forms, but rather about everything else.
Yes, everything.
Yeah. And also a question that then this sparks is, how does, let's say for me, how does composers, conception of this border, whether it is there or isn't, whether it will never be, or whether it's something that one has to set, what would you say? How does that, your conception of that, influence the way you compose?
So I think at this moment in time, what composition is doing is really, you know, highlighting the vagueness of that line between music and everything else. And we see that a lot in contemporary composition. But with me personally, I feel that this allowed me to add that interdisciplinary characteristic into my music and let it still be music. So what I do is I often, as I said, I take music and other art forms, let it be poetry, prose, or any kind of visual art, and I try to make the two cohesive and just make it into one work without there being a clear separation between the two. That I try to merge the art forms into one entity.
So to the question, if I understand you correct, the way you conceive of this, let's say, relationship between music and let's say everything else, or what is in music, what music encompasses, and the way you conceive what composition encompasses, motivates you to work as to work interdisciplinarily, so to incorporate as other art forms into one work.
Yes.
Right. Do you see, how do you see also today's, let's say you said you study in Peabody Institute and you come from Poland. I assume you studied then, your primary music education was there, right? In Poland.
I was actually in the United States.
So,
Yeah.
okay, so you already received the music education in the United States. But you were in touch with Polish folk music. Was that before
Yes.
before that, or?
That was all throughout my life. Ever since I was born up until today's day.
So you were in touch with that folk music through your family in United States, or did you also travel to Poland and participated there?
Both, actually.
And how would you say, do you observe the composition field, let's say from your experience, from these quite different environments also, I dare say, how would you observe that the novelty also of interdisciplinarity, since one hears that today a lot, and my thought is also probably in the folk music of Poland or any other country, there's always also dancing, always also poetry, stories, and more. It's in a sense, what I'm saying is that's also already interdisciplinary in today's terms.
Yes. So interdisciplinarity is obviously nothing new. I mean, as we see folk music itself and folk dance, it's a combination of two arts. Same thing, classical composers have, combined the visual arts and music, let it be Mussorgsky with pictures at an exhibition, for example. So in this sense, interdisciplinarity is nothing new. It's just the way we go about it today. It's, traditionally we have that interdisciplinarity, but it is two art forms, in my observation, do remain their own entities, and it's a very harmonious pairing of the two. Well, in the 21st century, we are asking ourselves to redefine art and music and composition, and merging all these separate entities, let it be philosophy, music, and art and creating something that is its own entity. It cannot be called, or it can be called music, but that is still up to us to fully experiment with it. And
so the difference that you see between, let's say, older forms of, and now we're speaking in this frame of 200 years older,
yeah,
what you see is the difference between the older forms of interdisciplinary composition and today's interdisciplinary composition would be the fact that before it was still separate entities in a harmonious relationship, as you said, and today it's more merged. Or is that what if I understand you correct? Do I understand you?
yes, that is what I'm trying to say.
And just I have to say, it's simply interdisciplinary composition as a term is something you really encounter today. Also in general in arts, interdisciplinary is something that we encounter a lot, and there's simply so many questions that sometimes I feel are not really resolved, as in is this really something new, and what about it is so new? Because when you look at the opera, that's also tightly merged different forms of art, right? Yet it exists for hundreds of years already. So is there something else that you would say that really defines today's interdisciplinary composition?
Well, I think the main thing that I would say describes today's method of interdisciplinary composition is really redefining. And I mean, as we see, the opera, it was also redefined. It's two entities into one. And that became a form itself. But I think that in this day and age, in today's century, I think we're doing way more of that than we used to. Again, just form is being redefined as well, and we're blurring the already vague lines. And I think that what the great example you gave, opera, is, I think in this century we may start to see more examples like that, where two entities merge into one and just become either a new form or new art itself or new kind of music.
What would you say will which kind of, if you had to say like what you see for the next in 100 years would emancipate itself as, let's say, opera did, what would
I think that it is
this is like
possible
speculation
that,
for
yeah,
fun,
it is speculation.
but also perhaps the important thought to be dedicated to what will the future bring in this field.
I think the key to unlocking the future and just being prepared for what the 21st century has to offer is an interdisciplinary education, as you may have guessed. I think that recently there has been a trend of specialization. And I really think that we're starting to see trends in interdisciplinary education, even during the past decade. And I think that will evolve over the next coming decades. And, inevitably, this kind of thinking will broaden people's horizons and new art forms will emerge. I cannot say what, but I think there will be some really unlikely combinations that may give rise to something that we haven't previously conceptualized.
And if you had, let's say, you have to say two of those, what would you say? Two operas that are not an opera, but opera
Yeah.
that operate on that same principle of becoming.
Well, I do think I do think that at the moment, the world of academic composition and just popular music, I think those are two very separate worlds at the moment. A lot of compositions exist in academia, and there are measures being taken actively to try to bring music closer to the people. And I think, music started as folk music. It is possible that we could possibly start taking folk music and taking something that people already know and building on that and making the world of new music more accessible and appealing to non-musicians.
So just to stick a little bit longer with the question of the new opera, if this is now, then I will drop it, okay? What would be like the name? What would be the specific, let's say, if I came to this place that is intended for this new art form, music art form, or just art form, what would I see if it was this not opera but the new something?
Yeah. I think it would be a kind of performance art, like opera is, I would argue. Something that involves, a visual component, I do think. Let it be through dance or movement, or the visual arts.
And
I do think.
would I sit in the audience as I sit in the audience when I go to listen to an opera, to see an opera? Would something else be different there?
I think that actually, I mean, throughout the entire course of history, these traditional art forms, they are not typically immersive. Immersive art forms, I feel like the 21st century gave rise to them. Previously, like an opera, theater, music, art, there is a certain distance between the art and the viewer. And it is quite possible that in the 21st century, we will actively work, or it may happen itself. We may close up that gap between the viewer and the artist and the art. And at the end of the century, there is a possibility that we can come up with an art form that will just be totally immersive for the viewer.
And how do you understand, use the term immersive here? What is that in distinction to what you would call traditional?
See, I would say that the immersion would probably lie in the viewer taking part in the creative process in some sort of way. Not to the extent where the artist doesn't stay the artist anymore. There is still that distinction between the artist and the viewer, but more of the creative process will be given to the individual who views the art and participates in it.
Have you ever implemented that into your own compositions?
I have not yet. I haven't done so yet, but in a sense, um, if we think about any kind of composition, I guess the players do their part. Um, and if we count the player as viewer as well, then in that case, the players, viewers can influence what the composition ends up sounding like. It is through their interpretation that the art comes to life. And we see that, we see that in the musical setting. But what I think will happen eventually is that this interpretation can be left up to the viewer. But I haven't done so personally. I have not worked with this yet. However, I would like to in the upcoming years try to immerse my audience into my art.
So assuming that there is an interpretation which is a part of the composition, let's say, what you are saying is that today, of course, it falls on the shoulders of the performer. And what you're saying is this part could become the part where the person that before only listened is active now, actually has agency in it, creates in it. What would that look like on an imaginary example? Or let's say if Aleksandra Woźniak had, 2 years to build something and let's say unlimited assets, what would happen? What would you do?
Oh goodness, this is a huge question, but I mean, I
know
at the
it's
moment
meant
I
to
would
have fun with. It's meant to
yeah
have fun with and to give it a
yeah.
try. Just what would happen?
Well, I would probably um experiment with the medium a lot. Get really creative with the medium, whatever that medium may be. It may be something that is directly influenced by the audience. Let it be some sort of contraption that regulates the emission of the sound in a way, or some kind of visual alteration, where the artist, the viewer, I should say, can create one of the aspects that is crucial to the performance. Possibly have the viewer, work on the visual component, which may not be that complex, but is a crucial part to the performance. That would totally include them in the compositional process and the art as well. Eliminating that gap between that label, actually, just the viewer, and redefining that label.
So if let's say we tried to put it into a metaphor, it's as if on the metaphor of a silent film with piano players, as if the artist provided with the film and the audience, it's just turned around from what you were saying, but still, as if the artist provided with the film and the what audience or viewers would provide with the piano playing, but just that it couldn't be. I mean, yeah, which is also essential to the whole of that. Let's say performance or silent film.
Yeah.
Yet, not the whole thing. I'm trying to grasp it.
Yes. Well, I'm trying to grasp it as well, because this is something that, is so futuristic, and I'm just afraid that at the moment it can't be fully conceptualized if it's truly innovative. So we only have the tools that we have at the moment to imagine, but something that may come along in a few decades will most likely need the step in between to conceptualize.
So you consider having those tools that are at this point inexistent as crucial to this step in what you would consider what you're saying could be the development or the step further in which in direction in which composition or art could go.
Mm-hmm.
And what can one then do to develop those tools? How do you ever face that question? Like, what do you have to develop in your practice to be able to fully realize what you can see in the future for composition?
Well, the most important thing, I think, for me and most composers is initially developing fundamentals and really having that solid ground to work on. But like in the future, what is most often the case is that it isn't the composer who creates both the tools and the music. And the tools, in a sense, they can be philosophical, so just a thought, an idea. It usually isn't the composer that comes up with the idea, which he then uses to create the music. And, I'm not talking about, musical ideas, just other interdisciplinary ideas that he may borrow from.
Do you mean like it was not the composers that developed the let's say audio equipment that afforded so much more also in music or in listening to music? Is that something in the lines of what you're addressing now?
That is an example. That's an example of a physical tool. I mean, it's also a matter of time. Composers don't necessarily have the time to hone their craft and come up with the tools that will allow them to continue their craft. So the artistic process actually it's not just the composer. It takes just like they say, it takes a village to raise a child. It's similar with the process of composition. It's not, we always owe it to the composer for the piece or the music or the art. Just the artist, we always owe it to the artist. But in reality, it's so much more than that. And without all the physical and philosophical tools that have been uncovered to this date, the composer would not be able to hone his craft.
Right, and that in a way also sheds light on why also on why interdisciplinary, even if not composition itself, just how interdisciplinary is anyway necessary to afford, like making a pen is actually important so that we can write with it. Right? It's
exactly.
Yeah. And
yes, understanding that each individual doesn't work in isolation.
Yeah.
It's actually, that's why it's important to think interdisciplinarily for the composer.
And you also mentioned fundamentals. What do you consider being fundamentals in this case? What is something that needs to be set to be able to grow from there?
Well, it's actually strange when I think of fundamentals, not just in composition, but in any art form. It is usually very isolated. We think of fundamentals as for example, composition, it's strictly music. The fundamentals are theory, are Bach. It's all involving music. For art, visual art, it's sketching, form, drawing. It never involves any other art forms, which then once we develop those fundamentals, then I would say we revisit them and truly learn the fundamentals, which is, in my opinion, interdisciplinary thinking. But it's not what we're initially exposed to.
And how, for example, did you work with developing fundamentals or in your practice of composition?
Well, initially, alongside doing music, I did other art forms. I wrote and I painted. And initially, these three art forms, they existed in isolation. While I was building those fundamentals in each art form, which usually involve form and everything that we see traditionally, getting that base of knowledge, just getting familiar with the literature in each art form. And then with time, as you get more knowledgeable around the basis of these art forms, you start to see connections and realize that these forms actually feed off of each other. And that becomes the new fundamental. You discover this harmony between the art forms, and you start at zero again, in a sense, because it's something completely new, and you have to work to uncover, the history of not only the history, but these new fundamentals, in a sense.
Yeah, curious. So it's building fundamentals from sets of acquired fundamentals.
Exactly.
That's then a different definition of what it means to have a skill set and fundamentals set. Great. So since we're now going towards the end of our conversation, I would like to conclude with two questions. One is, what is something that you, if there is something that you would like to convey to, let's say, a young composer, or maybe an elderly composer that is looking at this conversation? And the second one, to someone that will listen to music and also that will listen to your music. So what would you say to the first? What would you say to the last?
Well, I would surely say to the young composer to not get discouraged by all this talk of fundamentals, because it's true that it's a long process, but there's value in every step of the way, and it really pays off. And I don't think anyone ever truly is done learning. We always have to hone these fundamentals, and we just inevitably keep building upon these sets. And it's more enjoyment of the process of doing so, rather than the goal, because there's no certain limit, at least, to what we see. And then, well, when listening to my music, I really hope that, see the elusive nature of the titles and of the form, and make your own connections with the other art form that I draw from, and really think cohesively. My music does not exist in isolation.
Hmm. And where can we reach? Where can one reach your music?
So I will be having a website very soon,
Hmm.
which will be launched in a few months, and I will upload there.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much for for this conversation, and yeah, until next time.
All right, thank you, Neža.